Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back once again to Now TV and Morning Musings. I am your host, Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I hope you'll check out my website, donkpreston.com or BibleProphecy.com. Either website has a wealth of information on it. Literally, folks, hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of articles, totally free to download. Okay. A ton of books that we offer for sale, for research, and for study. That includes my two newest books. My newest book, and I got to show you something here in a moment. As a result, some people wanted to see one of my newest books, entitled Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, a study of the relationship between Israel's last feast day, i.e. Sukkot, and the resurrection. This has been, so far, one of the most popular of all of the books that I have written. And I've now written about, 34, 35 books, something like that. So anyway, pardon me. I do want to thank you for tuning in. Now, just a moment here. I mentioned last week, and you'll notice over my shoulder here, I moved one of my other knives, and you can't see it real well, but I moved it over there because, I had some reaction. People said, well, yeah, I love to see your knives. I moved my hatchet somewhere else. You can't see it. It's behind me right there. You can't hardly see it. But I mentioned that a very good friend of mine, his name is Chris Polios, he sent me several knives. This is one of them. Now, folks, if that's not pretty, I don't know what is. I mean, that thing is gorgeous. And let me tell you, my wife often says, because I cut myself working on my old cars and what have you, she said, I just can't trust you with sharp things, can I? That thing, and he said, I don't know, there's 4 or 5 of them, something like that, if I remember correctly. But this thing, it's got a name on it that I can't read without my glasses. So anyway, that's the kind of stuff, as I shared with you last week. I just absolutely, totally love it. And my sincere appreciation to my good friend Chris for sending those along. All right, want to get right back into our discussion of the 70 weeks of Daniel and the bringing in of everlasting righteousness. Now, last week, I tried to lay some foundation work, tried to give us some background and context for the promise in Daniel chapter 9. Now remember, folks, we're talking about the challenge of Christ, that if he did not do what the Father gave him to do, told him to do, then we're not supposed to believe him. And he came to fulfill the law and the prophets. Jesus said, Matthew chapter 5, 17 and following, do not think that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, i.e., destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill, i.e., fulfill the law and the prophets. Okay? So that means that Jesus' mission, and let's not make the massive mistake of thinking that it was only during his incarnation that he came to fulfill the law and the prophets. That's a huge error. Well, how do I know that? I know that because Jesus, in speaking of the coming fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, he said, these are the days of vengeance in which all things that are written must be fulfilled. Well, if he came to fulfill all of the law and all of the prophets during his personal ministry, then how is he going to come back and destroy Jerusalem in fulfillment of, the law and the prophets? Can't do it, right? So we have a progressive period of fulfillment, beginning with his personal ministry, his incarnation, extending all the way to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So again, my focus here is on demonstrating the context for the fulfillment of all things. And last week, and yes, I am wearing this same shirt because I'm filming two videos on the same day. It's for me, it's not a week later. For you, it's a week later, right? Okay, so what I'm doing is setting that context that it was the lack of righteousness that sent Judah into Babylonian captivity. That lack of righteousness stemmed from the fact that, as I shared with you in closing last week, in Galatians chapter 3, 20 and 21, Paul says, if a law could have been given that could give life, then verily righteousness would have been through the law. But you see, ladies and gentlemen, the law was not given to bring righteousness. Now, does that mean the law was bad? No. Paul extolled the virtue, the beauty, and even the, quote, spiritual, unquote, nature of the old law in Romans chapter 7, 14 and following. But the law was weak because of the flesh. And the law was given to exacerbate, to magnify, to compound man's awareness of his sin. The law was added that sin might abound. Now, let me reiterate a point I made last week, folks. This is really, really critical. God did not give Torah to make man sin. To make man sin more and more. No. Man has never had a problem with sinning. God gave the law to make man more acutely aware of his sin. And being more acutely aware of his sin, to be more acutely aware of his need for a Savior, for redemption. So what did God do? God provided a sacrificial system in which he gave substitutionary sacrificial mandates to show his patience, to show his mercy. In other words, he did not exact punishment. He did not exact righteous judgment immediately when man sinned. David could sing the praises of Yahweh in Psalms 105 when he says, "O Lord, you are merciful, you are gracious. You have not dealt with me according to my sin. But as far as the east is from the west, so far have you removed my sin from me." Now look, David is not saying that forgiveness was objectively bestowed or imputed. David recognized that genuine forgiveness did not come through the law. It was extraneous from the law. They had to offer their sacrifices because the law said so, and because the law gave, what would be the right term for it? Provisionally provided forgiveness, not objectively. And thus man lived under the constant awareness of sin. As Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 and 2 says, "Now the law, having a shadow of the good things to come, can never, by those sacrifices which they make year by year continually," and by the way, they offered them daily, they offered them weekly, they offered them monthly. But Paul's emphatic. I say Paul because I still cling to the idea that Paul probably wrote Hebrews. No proof of it, I just like it. Anyway, the law, having a shadow of the good things to come, about to come, can never, by those sacrifices which they make year by year continually, make the worshiper, make the comer thereto perfect. For if, when those sacrifices were made, if forgiveness became an objective reality, the writer says those sacrifices would have ceased to be offered. But there was every year. Now he's talking about the Day of Atonement. There was every, Sorry about that, folks. I hope the audio is okay. I'll have to go back and listen to it. May have to redo the video. But anyway, Yahweh said, the writer of Hebrews says, that in those offerings which they made every year on the Day of Atonement, there was a remembrance made every year. In other words, every year that they came before Yahweh on the Day of Atonement, guess what? They had to remember their sin through confession. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not just that's not a concept that just fills me full of joy and would make me want to live under Torah. I believe it was Charles Spurgeon who said in the 19th century, which of us today laments the fact that we do not have to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year? Which of us today is saddened by the fact that we do not have to kill a lamb, a bull, a goat, a pigeon? Which of us today mourns the fact that we have a high priest, one high priest, who lives forever to make intercession for us? You see what Spurgeon was saying? Spurgeon was saying that under the old law, through the practice of their sacrifices, they were continually being reminded of their inability to be forgiven, their inability to keep the law perfectly. And this Paul could say in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 10, that no man is justified by the law. It is evident, for the just shall live by faith. And all of those who are under the law are under a curse. As it is written, cursed is everyone that does not continue in all things that are written in the book of the law to do them. And James would express it like this: whosoever keeps the perfect law of liberty and yet offends in one point, he is guilty of the whole law. One sin, guilty of the whole mess. Folks, that's not grace. That is not mercy. God had to give grace in spite of the law. That's why David said what he did. So once again, I'm laying the foundation here for understanding the magnitude, the glory of the promise in Daniel chapter 9. Now, believe it or not, all of this is directly related to the challenge of Christ. Because, you see, Christ's second coming was to do what? To bring in the new heaven and the new earth, wherein dwells righteousness. Because there, the Father and the Son dwell, and they are the light and the life and the righteousness of all who are therein. So I'm getting to that point. I'm just simply trying to lay the groundwork, the foundation for understanding, once again, the glory of Daniel chapter 9. 70 weeks are determined to bring in everlasting righteousness. And you see, other Old Testament passages, other Old Testament prophecies foretold the time in which Israel's sin would be removed. And when Israel's sin, when Israel's salvation came to a realization, then what would happen? Well, Isaiah chapter 60 through the end, actually from chapter 40, through the end of that great book, over and over and over again, we find the promise that when Yahweh would restore all 12 tribes, when Yahweh would restore Israel under the imagery of, quote, Zion, unquote, what would happen? Well, you would have the restoration of the tribes of Jacob. you would have the redemption of Israel. And then, as Isaiah 49, verse 6 and 7 says, Yahweh speaking, it is too small of a thing for you, that's Messiah, too small of a thing for you to be the Redeemer of Israel and to restore the tribes of Jacob. I will also make you a light to the Gentiles. Christ, Messiah, was going to save and restore Israel, the tribes of Jacob. And in addition to that, do what? He will be a light to the nations. That's us. That's Gentiles. Salvation was going to be brought to the world through the conduit, if I may use that term, of Israel. And in Isaiah chapter 40, you see, God had that provision made to bring about forgiveness for Israel. Forgiveness for Israel would lead to forgiveness for the nations. Back to Isaiah 49, salvation is for Israel. And what was going to happen there? This is so beautiful. Okay? Remember at the time of Daniel chapter 9, the two tribes of Israel, Judah and Benjamin, are alienated from the 10 northern tribes. All right? You got that? So you have alienation of the 10 tribes from the two southern tribes. But in addition to that, you had alienation between all 12 tribes and the Gentiles. So what was God promising in Isaiah 49? He was promising to restore the tribes of Israel and Jacob. That's the reconciliation of all 12 tribes. But this is where it gets good for you and me. In addition to reconciling the 12 tribes, God would also reconcile the Gentiles to himself through Israel. Now keep in mind, folks, Israel, alienated from God, was dead in sin. That's how they're described in Ezekiel 37. In captivity, in bondage, out of the land, away from the temple, away from the city, etc., dead in captivity. Obviously, not dead biologically. But you see, the Gentiles had never been in covenant relationship with God. They were basically intrinsically, may I use that term, dead. As Paul would write in Ephesians chapter 2, remember that you, being strangers and foreigners, aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, having no hope, and without God in this world, they were dead. Gentiles were dead. So here are the two bodies of the dead. The dead of the 10 northern tribes, 3 bodies if you please. The dead body of Judah and Benjamin, and the dead body of the Gentiles. The death there having nothing to do with biological death. So God said he was going to reconcile the whole house of Israel to himself. So if reconciliation meant being brought out of sin, forgiven, it meant resurrection. Reconciliation equaled resurrection. And for the Gentiles who would accept him by faith, guess what that meant? They had never known God. They had always been alienated from God. They were always without hope, without God in this world. But then they, along with the 12 tribes, would be reconciled to God, raised from the dead. Reconciliation equals resurrection. Folks, you catch the power of that? This is why I have said over the last couple of weeks that the skeptics, atheists, Muslims, Jews, agnostics, they fail to understand the very nature of eschatology, which means they fail fully, absolutely, 100% in their claim, Jesus' prediction was he was going to come, put an end to human history, and, create a new physical heaven and earth, and he failed to do that. No, ladies and gentlemen, the problem was alienation from God through sin. It wasn't biology. It was not a tissue issue, i.e., this stuff. That was never the problem. The problem was sin. Problem was alienation. Just like in Daniel chapter 9, Daniel and Judah are in Babylonian captivity. They are in their graves. That's how it's described in Ezekiel 37. Why? Because of sin. Unforgiven sin. So back to Isaiah chapter 40. What did God say in Isaiah chapter 40? Rejoice, rejoice, O Israel, for God has forgiven you. He has removed your sin. Well, it wasn't a reality at the time of Isaiah chapter 40. But he said, a voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Let every valley be filled, let every mountain be brought low. Prepare ye for the coming of the Lord. Now, many people try to take that as the coming of the Lord in his incarnation, but that's false. But first of all, who is the voice crying in the wilderness? Who is the voice calling out to Israel, come and be forgiven? Look, folks, John the baptizer was Elijah. He was the voice of one crying in the wilderness. How do I know that? Because Mark chapter 1 verse 1 through 4 says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, a voice crying in the wilderness, and he names John. When John was preaching in the wilderness, John chapter 1 says in the Gospel of John, John the Baptizer was preaching. Two different Johns. But as John was baptizing in the wilderness, out there around Jordan, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes come out to him and they say, who are you? Are you the Messiah? And he said, no, I'm not. Are you the prophet? No, I'm not. See, they were expecting a literal physical reincarnation, perhaps a physically resurrected Elijah. And he said, no, I'm not that. Well, who are you then? I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness. But what was the voice to offer, ladies and gentlemen? Forgiveness, reconciliation, resurrection. John never said one single word about people being raised from the dead out of physical holes in the ground. John's entire message, but remember, John's entire message is the reconciliation of Israel. Something that they had never had before, something that they needed desperately. And so here is John coming as the fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 40. And by the way, I've written a book entitled Elijah Has Come, a solution for Romans 11, 25 to 27. It is a discussion, in-depth discussion of the incredible importance of John the Baptizer as Elijah. I have said this in the book. I will say this many, many times. Other than Jesus, other than Paul, John the Baptizer is the most significant eschatological figure in the entirety of the New Testament. because John was to come as the voice, as the messenger, and as Elijah, saying, prepare the way of the Lord. For the Lord will come, Isaiah chapter 40, verse 10 and following, and his arm shall descend, and his reward will be with him. Well, that's not the incarnation of Jesus. That's his coming in judgment. So what did John as the voice, what did John as the messenger have to say about this coming of the judgment? He said to the audience that was coming to him, who has warned you to flee from the wrath that is literally about to come? Now, did John preach repentance? Yes. Did he repent? Did he offer forgiveness? Yes. John was in the wilderness preaching a baptism for the remission of sin. Folks, they couldn't get that anywhere else. Remember, the sacrifices in the temple were a constant reminder of sin. John is out there in the wilderness doing something that is so radically different. So John's message, ladies and gentlemen, John's message was essentially one when he proclaimed, be baptized for the remission of sin. John's message was the time for the fulfillment of Isaiah 40, Isaiah 49, Isaiah 60, Isaiah 61, Isaiah 62, which, by the way, is quoted in Matthew 16:27. John's message of saying, come out to be baptized for the remission of sin. What are the temple priests to think? You can't do that. We offer sacrifices for sin. But you see, in offering forgiveness through baptism, what was John offering? John was saying that the time for the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 9 had arrived. Now, was he saying that the 70 weeks were completely up? Nope. Because Christ had to come. Christ had to come his second time, apart from sin, to bring righteousness. And we're going to develop this even more in the weeks to come. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next week.